that I think we all, experience trauma, and we all experience mental health crises at different points. It's just some of us maybe are in a better position to be able to be resilient after that moment, and or those sort of things. What word of advice, encouragement would you give to pastors as it relates to their own mental health? Because one of the things that I was thinking about in preparing for this call is that therapists often work in community, and so you share kind of the scenarios of your cases, and you get advice and insight from each other, and you kind of share the load in some levels with each other, different than say pastors do. Pastors tend to put on the Superman cape and carry the load completely and entirely by themselves. I'm confessing. So what is it that pastors can do, maybe as a way of taking care of their own mental health? What word of advice or encouragement would you give for that?
That's a great question. And by the way, we do that too as counselors, but we are trained for self-care. So because we know that our field is a high burnout field, if you're not careful, you can have difficulty with boundaries and not set enough boundaries to be able to take care of yourself. So I think, first of all, self-assess from time to time. The CDC actually did, they partnered with the Census Bureau, and they did an experimental data system called the Household Pulse Survey. And they just sent out this survey of, I don't know how many, but anyway, 29.5% of Texans reported symptoms of anxiety disorder, and 29.5%, it's up from 29.5% about a year ago. So the reason I mention this is it's just a 4-question survey. So pastors could go in and just answer these 4 questions and say, where do I stand? How am I doing? And 2 of them are just very quick personal health questions. Over the last 7 days, how often have you been bothered by having little interest or pleasure in doing things? Would you say not at all, several days, more than half the days, or nearly every day? And then over the last 7 days, how often have you been bothered by feeling down, depressed, or hopeless? Would you say not at all, several days, more than half the days, or nearly every day? You just select an answer, and then there's 2 anxiety questions over the last 7 days. How often have you been bothered by feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge? Would you say not at all, several days, more than half the days, or nearly every day? And then over the last 7 days, how often have you been bothered by following problems, not being able to stop or control worrying? Would you say not at all, several days, more than half the days, or nearly every day? So you can look at those results and just give a score, basically 0 to 3, not at all, to nearly every day, and a sum of equal to 3 or greater on the anxiety is associated with generalized anxiety, or has been associated with being diagnosed with generalized anxiety. For adults with a score of 3 or greater, really, it would be a good idea to see somebody and talk with them about it. Same thing with the personal health questionnaire. A sum equal to or greater than 3 has been associated with the diagnosis of major depressive disorder. So we're looking at depression and anxiety on these 2 scales, which are the 2 primary indicators of other kinds of issues. You may have a clinical depression, you may just be sad, but if you're scoring in that 2 to 3 range, it might be a good idea to talk to somebody about it. I think, again, we do kind of put that Superman cape on and say, well, I can deal with this. I have the Lord in my life, and I can just, but that's not the message we want to send our parishioners. So that shouldn't be the message we send ourselves. Don't be afraid to seek counseling for yourself or your marriage or your family. You can be the best role model by saying, you know what, it's okay to seek wise counsel, recognize the signs and symptoms, and reach out to a professional if you need support. I think another thing we can do is take time for refreshing. You sent out an email recently about the retreat center. I think taking a couple of days off every now and then and going and retreating, and, not so that you can prepare your message.
What? I'm not supposed to be just getting away so I can have time to write a sermon?
But just go and do something fun, spend some time with your family, find a hobby, read a book, take a trip, whatever. Do something that gets your mind away from all of the stuff that's going on around you. There's also some burnout questionnaires, pastors tend to, well, anybody in the helping profession, when we start losing interest in things, depression over time is going to lead to burnout. And the more you're burned out, the less you're going to be helpful, because one of the symptoms of burnout is emotional exhaustion. And then there's this emotional detachment that we have, and that's one of the worst things you can have as a pastor, right? To be detached from your congregation. But if you notice that you're starting to detach emotionally and you kind of like, I don't really care. Might want to take a look at, is there something else going on? Am I overdoing it? Am I burning out? And again, just self-assess, and listen when people are saying to you, you're doing too much. Maybe you are. And I think that's something that all pastors and helpers, I have to constantly do that as well. I think all helpers need to be engaging in self-care, taking care of ourselves, and assessing where we're at.
So last question, and this one wasn't in our pre-work, so this is maybe a little bit off the cuff here, but how can congregational leaders do a better job in developing a congregation that it's safe for a pastor to have those moments to take a break, have those moments to self-assess and be honest about the assessment? Because I think, if in the quiet of the heart of a pastor, there may be the honesty, but then if I confess that, how's my church going to respond to that? How can congregations do a better job of creating that healthy system for their caregiver to make sure that he or she is being cared for?
That's such a great question. And I think there's a delicate balance there, because they do look up to the pastor, they look up to leaders, right? I mean, I think leaders need to also go through this same process of self-assessment, not just the pastors, but all of the leaders need to go through this process. I think authenticity throughout the congregation is important. If the members feel like they have to come to church and be perfect, and then they go home and they deal with real life, then they're not going to allow for mistakes, or they're not going to allow for those moments of weakness when we're feeling sad, because they have to be perfect when they come in. And I do think it kind of comes from the top down, because it's a culture that we inbred. Can we be authentic? Small groups is a great place to get that started. Let's be authentic with one another. Let's not just talk about problems over here, but let's talk about what's really going on with us. What are we dealing with? How are we, and then how can we help one another? Because when I'm down, you may be up, and when you're down, I may be up. So how can we help one another through those times and not, judge one another for it, but recognize that that's just a part of life, and help to support one another through those processes. There is a balance there, though, because I know that pastors also have to be a role model, and there's this, you don't want a pastor who's crying on stage every single week 24/7.
Well, only if it's effective for getting people to come to the altar.
That's true, that could be. So there certainly is, a balance there, but I do think that pastors need to be vulnerable enough to be able to say, hey, I'm dealing with stuff. And that's hard, because I think we judge pastors really, really harshly. And we should, rightly so, right? Because I mean, to a certain degree, because pastors and leaders are leading the congregation, but we have to be careful that we're not judging them, again, the whole log in the eye sort of thing, with a way that we wouldn't want to be judged. So authenticity, I would say, all the way around. And, being willing to talk about things from an authentic, real perspective.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for that. I think a good reminder for us as pastors is that who we are on the platform isn't all of who we are.
That's a good
And
point.
there may be times when we need to have conversations in private that never make their way up to the platform.
Right.
But that's the place that we express our emotional fatigue and our verge of burnout. And hopefully we've got leaders who can receive it. But I think your point of in educating the leaders as to kind of how it is that they can check in on themselves creates a system whereby we're all able to be honest about, hey, we'll have those moments where we need to rejoice with each other, but we'll also have those moments
I
where we
think
need to weep with each other.
I think you also need to have regular conversations. You know, you know, Tim talks a lot about leadership community and encourages churches to have a leadership community where on a monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly at the least basis, the leaders come together for community, not just to have somebody come in and train them and then they go home, but to really begin talking to one another about issues in leadership and talking to one another about, you know, just talking to each other about things that they're facing. And if you're sitting at a table with somebody that you don't normally sit with because you've been forced to sort of rearrange the, you know, in a fun way, then all of a sudden you're sitting with somebody and you're having a community with somebody that you wouldn't normally have community with. And you're becoming more authentic as you develop those communities. So I think regular conversation, regular community begins to lend itself to that authenticity. If we just come to church, sit down, say hello, how you doing, and go home, we're not going to have that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Dr. West, thank you so much for your insight. I know we could spend hours discussing a number of different things that have been brought up, but I really appreciate your feedback and your participation in this recording today. So thanks so much.
Yes, you're very welcome. And I do want to say one other thing. I know I probably said way too much. You're going to have to edit this way down. Okay. How can we help people? I do think we have to not be afraid to ask the hard questions too. Are you having thoughts of suicide or harming yourself or anyone else? That's a question that we often kind of gloss over and we don't want to ask because we're afraid that it's going to make them think about suicide. But we know as professionals that that's not what it does. It actually helps them to talk about it. So don't be afraid to ask the tough question. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you having thoughts of harming yourself? Are you having thoughts of harming someone else? Second question, do you have a plan on how you would do it? Because we do know that people who have a plan are more likely to carry out suicide than those who don't. So that increases their risk of suicide. And then you know you need to get some immediate help for them. So don't be afraid to ask the hard questions inside as well as outside the congregation.
Thanks so much for that last little bit there. That's really powerful, really powerful. So, thank you.